On the 27th of January, 2009, an officer of Kenya Power and Lighting Company walked into a substation on the edge of a small western Kenya town called Webuye and threw a switch. The power line he disconnected fed a single customer. That customer was a paper factory called Pan-African Paper Mills. The unpaid electricity bill by that morning was 201 million Kenyan shillings. Inside the factory, two giant Fordrinier paper machines that had run almost continuously for 35 years went still. By the end of that week, the largest paper factory in Eastern and Central Africa had stopped producing paper. By March, the company was in receivership. Total debt, 9 billion Kenyan shillings. Direct workers retrenched, 1,300. Dependents in Webuye who had built their lives around that factory, an estimated 30,000. By the end of the year, the town of Webuye, which had been built by Pan-African Paper Mills, was being killed by its closure. This is the story of a factory that built a town and then killed it. And the Kenyan industrialist who, 7 years later, bought what was left for 900 million shillings against a peak book value of 18 billion, and is now in the middle of the most ambitious industrial restart Kenya has seen in a generation. Hi again. Welcome back to the pod. My name is Farouk, and today we are going deep into the story of Pan-African Paper Mills, the factory that for 35 years was the single largest industrial complex in Kenya before it collapsed in 2009 and took the town of Webuye down with it. The restart that is now underway, almost 2 decades later, is one of the most important industrial bets being made on Kenyan soil right now, and it sits uncomfortably at the intersection of two of the most contested arguments in Kenyan business: whether import substitution industries can ever come back, and whether a single private family should be allowed to own this much of the country's industrial heartland. Let's get into it. To tell the story of Pan-African Paper Mills, we have to start with a political problem that the Kenya of 1964 did not yet know how to solve. The country had been independent for less than a year. Its economy had been built by colonial design to do one thing: export raw materials through Mombasa, import everything else through Mombasa, including paper. Every form, every textbook, every newspaper page in independent Kenya was, in those first years, an imported product. The foreign exchange that left the country every year just to keep schools and government offices supplied with paper was a real and unromantic line item on the national balance sheet. The young government's answer was a doctrine the rest of the post-colonial world was also embracing: import substitution, industrialization. Build, at home, what you had been importing, behind a tariff wall, with development finance and a foreign technical partner. Sessional Paper Number 10 of 1965, the foundational document of Kenya's economic policy, made it explicit. A national paper mill was at the top of the wish list. The site that emerged from the feasibility studies of 1964 was Webuye, a small railway stop in what was then Trans-Nzoia district, also called Broderick Falls. 3 things made it the right answer: the Nzoia River, for process water; the Western Highland softwood plantations, planted by the Colonial Forest Department since the 1930s, for fiber; and the politics. The single largest industrial investment in independent Kenya was going to anchor itself in a part of the country that Nairobi and Mombasa industrial policy had historically ignored. By 1970, the deal was structured. 3 sponsors: the government of Kenya, holding the largest equity block and providing the land, the forestry concessions, the railway spur, and the power line. The Birla family of India, through Orient Paper and Industries Limited, the dominant Indian newsprint maker, taking 29% of the share capital and the technical management contract, and the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group, providing the long-term dollar-denominated debt that would buy the German and Finnish craft pulp machinery that formed the technical core. It was a textbook tripartite development deal of its era: a young state, an Indian industrial dynasty, a multilateral bank. On the 2nd of November 1972, President Jomo Kenyatta laid the foundation stone at Webuye. 2 years later, in 1974, the first paper machine was commissioned and commercial production began. At that moment, Pan-African Paper Mills was the largest paper factory in Eastern and Central Africa, the largest single industrial complex in Kenya. A vertically integrated kraft mill on 300 acres on the banks of the Nzoia, with its own chipping plant, its own pulp line, its own recovery boiler, its own paper machines, its own finishing line, its own fleet of trucks, and very soon, its own residential township. Webuye in 1974 had been a frontier railway stop. Webuye by the early 1980s was an industrial town. The mill built its own housing, its own primary school, its own hospital, its own sports club. The population trebled. Mechanics, lorry drivers, woodcutters, school teachers, hospital nurses, kiosk owners, all earned their living, directly or indirectly, from the factory on the river. By the middle of the 1990s, the company claimed it had saved Kenya 8.1 billion shillings in import substitution and earned 407 million shillings in foreign exchange from paper exports to Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, Eastern Congo, Egypt, and the Middle East. Whatever you make of parastatal accounting in that era, the directional truth held. For the better part of 2 decades, this was the most important industrial success story the new Kenya had. The decline began quietly in 1992 with a policy decision made not in Webuye but in Nairobi and Washington. Kenya signed on, formally, to the structural adjustment programs prescribed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Import tariffs began to come down. The protected market that Pan-African paper mills had been designed to serve began, slowly, to be exposed to subsidized Asian and European paper imports. The unit economics that had worked in the 70s and 80s did not survive the 90s. The second problem was deeper than tariffs. The technical heart of the mill, the recovery boiler that turned waste chemicals from the pulp line back into usable inputs, was aging past its economic life. A pulp recovery boiler is, in a kraft mill, the single most expensive component to replace. Doing so requires shutting the mill down for months. Throughout the 2000s, every cabinet that considered Pan-African paper mills considered the same question. Recapitalize the recovery boiler at a cost of billions of shillings of public money, or run the existing equipment harder for another year and hope that next year would be different. Every year, the answer was the same: run it harder. The third problem was that the mill was poisoning the town. By the early 1990s, the documented effects of Pan-African paper mills on Webuye were severe. The kraft pulp effluent discharged into the Nzoia River caused recurring die-offs of fish, phytoplankton, and macroinvertebrates downstream toward Lake Victoria. The air over Webuye carried caustic, chlorine, and sulfuric acid emissions, and the pulp mill stench that everyone driving through on the Nairobi to Kampala highway remembers. Drivers wound up their windows. Iron roofing sheets in the town rusted from acid deposition. A community survey conducted in 1994 reported that more than 60% of children born in Webuye after 1974 had experienced breathing problems between the ages of 1 and 5. Formal complaints reached the World Rainforest Movement, the IFC's own compliance advisor ombudsman, and after 1999, the new National Environment Management Authority of Kenya. Each cycle of complaint generated a press response from the mill's management, a NEMA inspection, a promise of remediation, and then a return to the same status quo. The mill was too important to close. The pollution was too persistent to fix without billions of shillings that nobody was willing to put in. And then, sometime in 2008, the operational management of Pan-African paper mills, contracted from Birla and Orient Paper of India, began quietly preparing to leave. The Indian managers who had run the mill for 35 years had, by their own later admission, run it down to the point where it could no longer pay the most basic operating bills. The technical advisory contract had become, by then, a contract to manage a slow descent. By late 2008, the senior Indian operating personnel were boarding flights home. In January of 2009, an unpaid electricity bill of 201 million Kenyan shillings hit the threshold at which Kenya Power and Lighting Company is required, by its own internal rules, to disconnect a defaulting customer. On the 27th of January, the power was cut. The paper machines, designed to be shut down only with engineered cooling procedures, stopped under load. 2 months later, on the petition of Kenya Commercial Bank, Barclays Bank Kenya, Ecobank Kenya, and Bank of Baroda Kenya jointly owed 1.4 billion shillings of short-term debt. With a further 7.6 billion in long-term debt and supplier obligations behind them, Pan African Paper Mills was placed in receivership. The aftershock traveled out from the factory gate in months. 1,300 direct employees lost their jobs. Roughly 30,000 indirect dependents lost their household incomes. Shops closed. School enrollments dropped. The Pan Paper Hospital ran out of consumables. The company housing estate emptied. The town of Webuye, which the mill had built, began to die. The first attempt to bring the mill back was made by the government of Kenya itself. Between 2010 and 2014, the Treasury injected approximately 1.2 billion shillings into the receivership process to pay down short-term lenders and prepare the asset for a restart. Not a single paper machine started up. By the time the Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee got around to auditing the file in 2014, the report described the spend as a case study in how not to revive a firm in financial distress. The 1.2 billion shillings was substantively gone. Through those same years, multiple consortia approached the receivers with restart proposals. Some were Kenyan, industrialist families. Some were Indian and South Asian paper businesses. At least one was an earlier rye-related entity that, by some accounts, took a look and walked away. None of them produced a sustained restart. Every quarter that passed without paper coming off the machine added to the depreciation of the asset. By 2015, the receivers were running out of options. The asset was decaying physically. The original book value of the going concern, once estimated at around 18 billion shillings, had been eroded by 6 years of standing idle. A formal auction was structured. 5 bidders presented offers. The winning bid came from the Rai group of companies, the Kenyan Punjabi industrial family, chaired by Jaswant Singh Rai. The agreed price, 900 million Kenyan shillings. The local press framing landed almost immediately. The Standard ran the headline that everyone in Kenyan business remembers. A factory once worth 18 billion shillings, sold for 900 million. The framing oversimplified. 18 billion was peak going concern value, not distressed realizable value. 6 years of asset decay had eaten most of the gap. A competitive auction with 5 bidders is, on paper, a fair price discovery mechanism. But the headline carried political weight, because the buyer was not an anonymous strategic investor. He was a man whose family already controlled close to half of Kenya's sugar industry, and whose name had been at the center of some of the most politically charged industrial controversies of the previous decade. Jaswant Singh Rai, the chairman of the Rai group of companies, is one of the most important and most controversial industrialists in Kenya. The Rai family business empire spans sugar, edible oils, timber, paper, and real estate. By 2020, the 4 Rai family sugar mills together accounted for roughly 45% of total sugar sales in Kenya, making him the single most powerful figure in the country's sugar industry. None of this disqualified him from acquiring Pan-African paper mills. All of it shaped how the acquisition would be read. In December of 2016, the Rai Group took formal possession of the Webuye mill. The operating entity was renamed Rai Paper. The first 18 months were spent doing what 9 years of receivership and government bailouts had not done. Walking the plant, machine by machine, deciding what could be restarted and what could not. Hiring back former Pan Paper engineers who had moved to Nairobi or to Uganda. Negotiating fresh supply contracts for softwood pulp. Talking to Kenya Power, very carefully, about a new electricity account. In the middle of 2018, the first paper machine started up again. One line operational after 9 years of silence. Initial workforce, 280 people. Initial annualized output, around 21,000 tons. By any pre-crisis benchmark, modest. By the benchmark of the previous decade of failed restarts, transformative. Paper was coming off the Pan-African paper mills machine again. For the people of Webuye who had been waiting since 2009, that was a fact that mattered more than any spreadsheet. In November of 2021, the Rye Group commissioned a second paper machine, 500 million shillings of capital expenditure. Capacity targeted to between 35 and 40,000 tons per year. Workforce rebuilt from 280 to approximately 440. Three-quarters of the new hires were local youth under 35 years old. Through the 2020s, Rye Paper would report cumulative production of more than 39,000 tons, 362 million shillings paid in taxes, and 754 million shillings paid back to Kenya Power. The same utility whose disconnection notice had killed the mill in 2009 was now its single largest service provider. Then, around 2022 and 2023, the Rye Group began executing on the most elegant single piece of risk management in the whole revival. Kenya's Energy Act of 2019 had liberalized parts of the electricity transmission and distribution industry, opening the door to private wheeling of power between two industrial sites. Rye announced a 30-kilometer dedicated power line that would run from the West Kenya Sugar Cabras factory in Kakamega County to the paper mill at Webuye. The sugar mill's cane crushing operation generates excess electricity from its bagasse boilers. That excess would now run directly and privately to the paper mill. The factory, whose first life had been ended by an unpaid bill to Kenya Power, would, in its second life, be substantially insulated from Kenya Power tariffs and reliability. Then came 2025. The Rye Group announced a comprehensive 3 billion shilling industrial revival plan for Pan-African paper mills. The centerpiece of the plan was the replacement of the legacy pulp mill and the legacy recovery boiler, the same recovery boiler that successive governments had spent 2 decades deferring on, the same component whose decay had been the technical heart of the original collapse. Replacement, not refurbishment. A modern recovery line designed for both recycled fiber and sustainably sourced wood pulp. The post-revival capacity target, 74,100 tons per year, roughly 3 times the current level. The product roadmap, the existing craft and tissue lines, plus a return to newsprint production, plus a new specialty packaging line aimed at the growing East African e-commerce and consumer packaged goods markets. Rye Paper called it a beacon of employment, innovation, and pride for Webuye. The framing in the announcement was deliberate. Rye Paper was no longer presenting itself as a salvage operation rebuilding an old asset. It was presenting itself as a long-term industrial bet on the second life of Kenyan paper, anchored in Webuye, financed by Rye family equity, powered by Rye-owned sugar mill electricity, and operated by a workforce that was 3/4 local youth. Today, at the end of June 2026, Pan-African Paper Mills, trading as Rye Paper, is running both of its machines. Output is trending toward the upper end of the 35 to 40,000 tons per year band. The workforce is between 440 and 500 direct employees, 3/4 of them local youth, supporting an estimated 2,500 dependents in Webuye. The 3 billion shilling pulp mill and recovery boiler replacement is in active execution. The 30-kilometer power line from Cabra Sugar is in construction. The product roadmap that includes a return to newsprint is in commissioning. The town of Webuye has not yet returned to where it was at the peak. Commercial property prices and tenant occupancy are still below pre-2009 benchmarks. Schools and clinics that the original Pan Paper had built are receiving CSR support again. But the catchments they serve are smaller than they were at the boom. The mill restart has stabilized the town. It has not yet rebuilt it. The structural questions are the ones that did not have clean answers in 2009, and they still do not have clean answers in 2026. Whether a craft pulp mill should be operating on the Nzoia River at all in 2026, given the documented environmental legacy of the first 35 years. Whether the captive power line from Cabra Sugar genuinely insulates Rye Paper from the cost base that killed the original mill, or merely shifts the dependency from Kenya Power to a Rye-owned sugar mill whose own political controversies are unresolved. Whether the unit economics of a 74,000-ton East African paper producer can survive against subsidized Asian imports on a continent whose import tariff regimes have been steadily liberalized for 30 years. The environmental question is the most important and the least resolved. The original Pan-African paper mills was, by every available external measure, one of the worst point sources of industrial pollution in Kenyan history. The rye paper revival is being asked to do something the original operators conspicuously failed to do: produce paper at 3 times the current scale without poisoning the river or the air. The replacement of the legacy pulp mill and recovery boiler is the central technical bet that this is possible. NEMA permitting under Kenya's modernized environmental regime is in process. The local community is more environmentally aware in 2026 than it was in 1974. Every output ton the new mill adds raises the political stakes. The political question is almost as important. The Rye family already controls close to half of Kenya's sugar industry. With Pan-African paper mills running at 3 times current scale, the family will, simultaneously, control the most strategically important paper mill in the country and the country's largest sugar producer. That is a level of single-family concentration in Kenyan agro-industry that the country has not previously experienced. The political settlement around that concentration is being negotiated in real time. Every week, in the spaces between the Rye Group, the Bungoma County Government, the Cabinet, the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority, NEMA, and the Webuye constituency itself, none of those negotiations is over. The future of Pan-African paper mills will be written across those 3 questions. None of them has a clean answer. All of them are in motion. What is no longer in question is whether the mill can be brought back at all. In 2026, for the first time in 17 years, paper is coming off the Pan-African paper mills' machines again in real volume with a real workforce in a town that is slowly hearing its industrial heartbeat restart. In 1972, a newly independent Kenyan state, an Indian industrial family, and a World Bank arm built a paper factory on the banks of the Nzoia River that became the largest industrial complex in the country. In 2009, an unpaid electricity bill killed it. In 2016, the most controversial sugar industrialist in Kenya bought what was left against a peak book value of 18 billion shillings for 900 million. Today, 10 years later, both paper machines are running again. A 3 billion shilling revival is underway, and Webuye is, slowly, learning what it means to have its industrial heart beating for the second time in 2 generations. This is a Asili Africa. Every empire has an origin. That is the story. And like every story worth telling, this one is still being written. If this episode made you see something differently, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I am Farouk. This is Asili Africa. Every empire has an origin. Now you know this one. So start building, because yours might be tomorrow's origin story. See you on the next one.